Listen, were you in the Commons last night for the vote?
Good morning.
Morning.
I was in my department working very hard. In the end, I abstained, and perhaps I could just explain why I did that. So I took the report very seriously. I studied it very seriously. I was very content that the inquiry had been carried out with great integrity and great diligence. I agreed with the conclusions reached in terms of wrongdoing on the part of Boris Johnson, but I was distinctly uncomfortable with the harshness of the sanction. I think a sanction of 90 days, which, to put that into context, is 9 times the threshold of 10 days required in order for there potentially to be a recall petition for a sitting MP, was just too far out there for me to vote for the motion. But I certainly wouldn't have voted against, but in the end, on the back, I went for abstention.
Yeah, except the 90 days was symbolic, wasn't it? I mean, it's irrelevant because he was never coming back, and it was a sanction against the undermining of a parliamentary process that he had set about doing.
I don't think the level of the sanction is purely symbolic. I think it's very meaningful in at least 2 ways. One is I think it should reflect the severity of what has happened. But secondly, it also sets a precedent for what might happen in future, where individuals are perhaps subject to an inquiry by the Privileges Committee. And as I say, I just thought that to go from a very high bar that is a 10-day sanction, which could lead to a sitting MP losing their seat, to actually ending up at 90 days, for me was just too far. But as I say, in terms of the substance of the report on whether Boris Johnson willfully misled Parliament and his reaction to the committee during the parliamentary inquiry process and so on, I did agree with their conclusions, and I think they came to the right conclusions.
Yes, so you disagreed with your cabinet colleague Gillian Keegan, others like Tom Tugendhat, Penny Mordaunt, and indeed your former boss Theresa May, who stood up in the chamber and made the point that colleagues must hold their own to account. And a lot of people will say by abstaining, effectively you are endorsing lying to Parliament, and perhaps that you are showing weakness, and indeed Prime Minister Rishi Sunak is showing weakness.
No, I think if I'd voted against the motion, I think some of the suggestions you're making there might have greater validity, but I didn't do that. But look, different members of Parliament voted different ways on this, and I think I respect the fact that each one of us, on a free vote, has to sit down and examine the evidence and look at it in the round and balance one thing off against another in our own minds and come to our own conclusions. And I respect colleagues in the Cabinet who came to a different decision to me, but I've explained why it is that I came to the conclusion that I did.
Mr. Stride, so much to talk to you about today, so we'll jump about a bit here. This cost of living payment, which the government is making from today, £150 cost of living payment, over 6 million people will qualify for that. The decisions you guys have to make, you know, yesterday and today and all this week, you'll have people saying, but I can't pay my mortgage, help me out on that. But you've got to make that decision. No, we'll not help you out in that, but we will help these disabled people. Could you just explain to people what the extra cost is being disabled during this cost of living crisis?
Well, we recognise that with high inflation, where we are not unique in that respect, there are a number of countries that have very high inflation. In fact, when it comes to food inflation, countries like Germany and Sweden and Portugal have food inflation running at over 20%. So we are not unique. But we do recognise the pressures that that brings. So the payment of £150, it will be for 6 million disabled people, and it will go out between now and July the 4th. People don't need to apply. It will automatically go into their bank account where they're qualifying for certain benefits such as personal independence payments and disability living allowance and various other benefits. But look, this is part of a much broader package of support that we're putting out there. 8 million low-income households are going to receive £900 across the course of this year. Pensioners, £300 along with the winter fuel payment. We've obviously had the energy price guarantee, using windfall taxes on energy companies to, on average, halve the level of energy bills over the last year. We put the national living wage up by 9.7% as of this April. So a number of measures particularly targeted at those lower income households who will be struggling the hardest.
And what about those perhaps middle-income households, many of whom will be remortgaging, some of whom will be looking at 6% for 2-year fix now? An eye-watering figure. I remember Rishi Sunak quoting that figure during his leadership campaign as being a terrible place to be. And here we are, a year from an election, and that's exactly the situation we're in. These are people that should be voting Conservative. This has got to be a big concern for your party.
Well, it is generally a big concern. Of course it is, because we don't want people having to struggle in those circumstances. Just as though we are not unique in having high inflation in our country, we're also unfortunately not unique in having rising interest rates, because that's the monetary response that quite rightly the Bank of England is adopting to bring inflation down. The most important thing we can do now is to bring inflation down, and I'm confident that the Prime Minister's objective of halving inflation by the end of this year will be met. Now, if we can meet that, of course, what that will do is take pressure off interest rates, because inflation will be coming in a downward direction, as well as relieving those kind of cost of living pressures that are associated with inflation itself. So that's got to be our core mission, a really sound fiscal policy alongside the efforts of the Bank of England to bring inflation down.
This awful situation of the submarine gone missing whilst exploring the wreck of the Titanic, is there any practical help we as a government can offer?
Well, I mean, this, as you say, is just the most awful circumstance. We don't know whether this vessel is submerged or floating on the surface. The first thing that the US authorities in particular, who are leading the search here, because of course it's closer geographically to them, far closer than it is to us, is to try and locate this vessel. And of course, unfortunately, the clock is ticking, because as I understand it, the oxygen supplies on that vessel will only last for around 4 days. So time is very tight. But this is just an awful, awful situation. Our thoughts are with those who are caught in this terrible situation, and our hope is that the US authorities and others will be able to locate this vessel quickly, and obviously those people can be brought to safety. But a terrible, terrible circumstance.
Mel Stride, Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, thanks for your time this morning.
Thank you very much.